afternoon, fellow constitutionalists, and welcome to the Thursday edition of the Dan Clements Show, a Christian political talk show. I'm your host, Dan Clements, your constitutional warrior, fighting for your right just to be an American. It is December 13th, or actually December 14th, December 14th in the year of our Lord 2017. Remember, we're a hyphen-free, PC-free zone. God is still in control and He does love you. And I'm broadcasting live from the Hemlock Studios here in the beautiful, snowy Central Susquehanna Valley in the Great Keystone State. And it seems like I'm having to make a lot of apologies lately here. I told you like Tuesday, if I wasn't going to be able to do a show on Wednesday, that I would put out a little video. Well, they weren't supposed to be here till later in the afternoon yesterday. So I was all sitting here ready to go for the show yesterday, and 10 minutes before the show, they show up. And I did not have a chance to do anything as far as putting out any type of video, letting you know what was actually going on. So I do apologize for that. I did get the gas hooked up in the furnace, and after about an hour and a half of troubleshooting, I finally got the furnace to kick on. It was a loose electrical connection on the gas valve that's inside the furnace. Once I got that going, everything else worked great. The only thing I got left to do is disconnect the wood stove piping from the wood stove, shut it down, drain it, and hook that piping into the new furnace, and we'll be all set to go. We'll be able to really heat the house very comfortably and very cheaply, I'm sure, because this furnace, just to heat the basement and one other room, has hardly ran at all. And I'm well pleased with the way it's actually working. It's a little big for the two zones I have it on, so I'll be anxious to get it on the other two zones, or the other zone, the rest of the house. And hopefully that'll make a huge difference in how that's actually working in that. So today is the day. If you haven't already heard about it, today is the day that Ajit Pai and the FCC commissioners are going to vote on doing away with the open internet, net neutrality regulations that they have that are on the books now. And I'm beside myself with anticipation. I'm giddy with anticipation of them actually getting rid of any type of regulation that can in the future be used to stifle our freedoms and our liberties. And this has been the ongoing argument with net neutrality, with the pro-net neutrality folks out there, is they believe that government regulations are okay. They believe that they're not dangerous to our freedoms and our liberties. They believe the government knows best how to regulate something or how to do something. And to me, that's the funniest. That is the funniest argument I've ever heard in my life when it comes to regulations. You know, that, and when it comes to government, I read something or shared something in a thumbnail. If government's the answer, you're asking the wrong question. And that's absolutely true, folks. Nowhere in the history of government regulations has it ever been beneficial, freedom and liberty-wise, for the country as a whole. Now, are there always going to be some instances where folks are either left out or, I don't want to say hurt by regulations, but are there instances where the regulations don't do or what they're designed to do? Take the Title II utilities that we have in the country. Right now, until they vote today, Title II is the regulatory law of the land for the internet. However, even back when it was initially instituted, way back in the early 1900s, Title II utilities, the idea was that making them a Title II utility would force the utility, especially electrical and the telephone companies, to take their products out into the wilderness, as it were, out into rural America. And it forced them to do that with the telephone. And I haven't really checked because I haven't had a landline for years. But there used to be a tax on our landlines, telephones, that was to go towards making sure that there was telephone service out in the rural America. Last week, I shared with you on the show an article that talks about the government had collected $400 billion in taxes on the internet to be used to expand the internet out into rural areas. And according to the article, they're trying to find out, where's that money at? Why haven't $400 billion can go a long way to really beefing up broadband internet everywhere, but especially out in rural America. Why were we taxed and then not have things that tax money go for what it's supposed to go for? And honestly, people can't answer that. Progressives can't answer why, at least the ones that I've talked to can't answer why they like regulation so much, other than they think government can do a better job regulating industry and things like that. But the problem with that is there's always unintended consequences that go along with regulations. And there always will be, because you cannot hire anybody to a regulatory commission, I don't care what it is, a regulatory agency, or a group of somebodies, that they know better how to do things than people that actually have boots on the ground or are living in a state like the EPA. The EPA doesn't know our environment as well as the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. We have a unique environment here that other states may have similarities to in certain areas, but not totally unique in our climate, the hills, everything about us, down to the last molecule. Each state has unique challenges depending on the amount of industry, residents, streams going through, lakes that you have, foliage, trees, whatever. And so protecting the environment, in my opinion, is better done on a state and local level. So an agency like the EPA passes these one-size-fits-all regulations that states and local municipalities plus businesses have to adhere to. And they may either, a lot of times they're duplicate of what states have already on their books. And so businesses have to not only report to possible local municipalities, but the state regulators and then the federal regulators. And who do you think pays for that cost? You're talking about, if you already have somebody there that's helping, with the regulation compliance, depending on what that regulation is and depending on what your business is, you may have to have a whole department that is dedicated to nothing but making sure that you're compliant with regulations, whether they be local, state, or federal. And on top of that, you may have to have a consulting firm to help you navigate through these regulations, because sometimes these regulations are kind of foggy. They're not as clear as people would like them to be. They're not as clear as I think people intend them to be clear. So, having said all that, I've asked progressives before, who pays for the cost of regulations? Who pays for the cost of government? Like a tax. Governor Wolf wants to put a tax on gas companies when they extract natural gas out of the ground. To pay for whatever he wants here in the state government. The problem with that is that tax is going to hurt the middle and lower income brackets in the state, because those gas companies are not going to eat that. Those gas companies will pass that tax along as a cost of doing business. And so a lot of progressives, they don't get that. They just don't get that. And if you try to tell them anything different, they don't want to listen to you. They think you're just whining and snotting about government. And I'm not really. I don't. But what I want, and I'm not totally against government. I'm not an anarchist. I think government has its role. But I also think, especially our federal government, was created by the states. There's a heresy right there, just what I said, that the federal government was created by the states. You ask a lot of folks, they think the federal government was the first thing here that stepped foot on soil here in North America, when it wasn't. People have always come before governments, and people established their local towns and municipalities, which in turn established states. And then the states got together here in the United States anyway and designed the federal government and put the Constitution in place as a restraint on the federal government. But the problem with all of that, and the weak link, is we the people need to make sure that the federal government is staying within its bounds. If we do not hold our governments, local, state, and federal governments accountable, they'll do just about anything they want to do if we're not going to hold them accountable. So, and this is no different with net neutrality. If net neutrality is allowed to stand, it will become one of these regulations that just has a life of its own. It's going to grow and grow and grow, and it's going to become more costly for compliance purposes, which that's going to have to be passed on to the consumers. And if that's being passed on to the consumers, a lot of times consumers will buy a cheaper package, and so there's less profit for the ISPs to be had. And so there's going to be less innovation, less expanding, maintenance is going to go lacking, and eventually the system's going to break down. It's just like the electrical companies. For so many years, because they're a Title II utility, the states were allowed to set the rates, the electricity rates. And they were kept artificially low for, probably more than half a decade. And the problem with that, I discussed this on the show last week, the problem with regulating the rates of a utility is if you're going to regulate those, you got to regulate every business that has any association with that utility. The manufacturers of the electrical lines, the manufacturers of the metal towers, the insulators that hang on those towers, the transformers, the breakers, that are spread throughout the system, the wire coming into the house, all that kind of stuff, the transfer, the generation stations, and the substations and all the technology that goes into that, and the high power lines and everything. If you're going to regulate the utility and say you can only charge so much for kilowatt hour, you got to regulate these other companies and their prices that they're going to sell the utility, so they can stay competitive as far as and be able to invest in their infrastructure. What happens is after a while, the power company has to make decisions, and I can't blame the power company. They have to make decisions which part of the electrical grid they're going to take care of. And guess what? Guys like us that want to live out in the rural country, we're on the end of electrical leg out here, we call it. And because we're on the end of electrical leg, we don't have a lot of customers on this leg. So when we have massive power outages, we're one of the last ones to get our power restored. They're going to get the main population centers around us restored, and then they're going to come out in the country and start doing these end of the leg turn back on the power. That's why I bought a generator. But see, I understand that. I'm not really mad at PP&L for doing that, because they've had their prices for so many years that were just so low that they had to start picking and choosing what they were going to maintain. Now, in Pennsylvania, they deregulated that, and thank God that they did, but yet they still have this Title II hanging over them. And I think, honestly, I think that Title II, in my opinion, has to go. And I think eventually, with competition, right now, I think I have over a dozen, or maybe even close to 24 different power generation companies I can buy my electricity off of and use the PP&L lines as the transmission lines. Now, I get charged for the transmission lines, but that doesn't, what I get charged on the transmission lines doesn't affect, I could use a lot more power than I normally would, and my transmission costs are going to stay the same. You see what I'm saying? And I see eventually the last mile ISPs doing that. Matter of fact, I think they would be better off doing that instead of offering the access itself, just carry the transmission lines and set up, even in their own, like Service Electric Cablevision could set up their own ISP to transmit across their lines and offer the same ability to other ISPs and have competition go out there. There's going to be some people, even if it costs them a few extra dollars, there's going to be some folks out there that, for whatever reason, they don't like their local ISP, and even if they have to pay a few dollars more a month, they're going to go with somebody else to get away from them because they've got butt burn or something. Or it's like Comcast. There's a lot of people out there that hate Comcast. So if there's some competition in there, and the competition may be a little bit more expensive, they're going to switch to that anyway just to thumb their nose at Comcast. So there's a compliance cost, and there already has been a compliance cost to net neutrality and FCC regulations in general. Okay, and I have some articles here to talk about that. My buddy Dave's shooting me a message. Can you pull in the mic a bit closer? Oh, I can crank it up just a little bit. Let's see here. Oh, do. How's that? Is that a little bit better, Dave? I don't have it maxed out, but I'm I was kicking back and relaxing in my chair here, and Dave's got me all messed up. Oh, let's see here. Let me know if that's better, Dave. I've cranked up my volume on my. Oh, let's see here. Let me check one other thing here. Recording. Let me get over the levels. Let me see here. Just want to make sure my levels are up on this. Oh, no. All right, that should be, ooh, okay. When I switch things around on my desk here, my computer desk here, I had to, I didn't make sure my levels were reset. For some reason, when you unhook your speakers and hook them back in, it wants to mess the levels up. So he says that's much, much better. Welcome to the show, Dave. I apologize for this past couple of weeks here with the furnace and everything. Hopefully all that's behind me now, and we'll get things on the road here again. But let me get back here to this cost of compliance. And I have some articles here we're going to talk about. I have one from Newsonomics, it's called, estimating the true cost of FCC regulations. Net neutrality's cost to consumers pegged at $17 billion or zero. I want to read both those articles and get into that. I do want to get into this real quick here, this net neutrality violations, a brief history, and some other things to do with that. And I have one other thing I want to do before that that has to do with the Alabama senatorial election that was going on here, that let America vote. Some of these George Soros-backed groups, they have no problems of just lying through their teeth. And you can, and folks, and I've had this thrown back at me, well, just because I didn't mention that, it's not lying. Well, there is such a thing as called lying by omission. If you're doing research or supposedly doing research, putting information out to folks that they really, really need, then you should have come across a few things, and I want to get into this right after we get going on the show here, but it's just amazing to me, these folks out there they just lie. I don't know if it's because they can, or they have an agenda that they just have to adhere to, which is, I think, the most part of it is this: they have an agenda that they're just going to adhere to, and that's it. So let's get on here with the show here. Today's show is being brought to you by my affiliate marketer, Bluehost. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Bluehost. I have the DanClementShow.com, my show notes page, and that's where I have my podcast now. All my podcasts are being stored there, and I had an issue with my page. I had a couple different issues with my page. One, it wasn't even loading at all. So I got a hold of Bluehost, and they got on there and they said there was something wrong with their settings, and they corrected it within seconds after I got on a chat with this gentleman. And so they got the page figured out, and then I thought, okay, everything's good. And then I went in and started looking at like the past 5 or 6 pages that I put up there. They weren't loading either. And here's something, and he told me, he said, whenever you put your Seriously Simple podcasting hosting service in, that changed the setting on my permalink. And I didn't know that. So he told me just to make sure I make a note of this, that if something happens again, go check my permalink and make sure it's on name, not numeric. And it was set on numeric. I know some of that might confuse people, but again, I went to their support and they were fantastic. Within a minute or two, I had my answer. Everything was working great. And voila, I was back up and running. Folks were able to access the podcast and the show notes page. And it was all because I'm using Bluehost. And I can't say enough about their support. I've only used them, I think this is the 3rd time I've used their support on chat. And they were fantastic and got me going right away. So if you're looking for a hosting service, I can't say enough about Bluehost. I really can't. And they have deals going on all the time. So if you go to danclemenshow.com and click on the Bluehost widget at the top of the page, it'll take you to their site. That's my affiliate link. And you won't regret switching over to Bluehost, folks. You just really won't. All right, today's daily Bible reading comes from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 through 18. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must be aware of him. Now, he's writing this to Timothy, folks. Remember this. For he has greatly resisted our words. At my first defense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May not be charged against them, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be proclaimed fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion, and the Lord will deliver me from every evil work and preserve me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. You know, as Christians, when we're preaching the word, we're going to run into obstacles. And some of these obstacles might come from outside the church, but some of these obstacles might come from within the church. And we have to be aware of these things. We have to know, Paul named Alexander the coppersmith, did me much harm. And other folks stood against him in other congregations that he was working and preaching at. And we have this, sadly, we have this going on today also. So we need to be aware of that, but we also need to make sure that we're doing God's will, God's way, with all love and with all the love and humility that we can muster. But we can't compromise God's word because someone doesn't agree with us on either the way we deliver it or because the message is stepping on their toes, as it were. I've had people come up to me over the years and really not get after me, harshly, but say, hey, you need to back off on sermons like that. And my first question in my mouth is why? I'm preaching the truth in love, and come to find out they were having issues with that, and they didn't really didn't really agree with the message of the Bible. And a lot of times it came about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And that's one of the stickier subjects out there. Today's quote mail comes from Avery D. Miller. My liberty as a Christian should always be supremely shackled by the love I am commanded to have towards another. Paul has a whole section in his epistles, a couple different epistles, talking about his liberty and how he doesn't use his liberty as an excuse. And if his liberty is going to cause another brother to stumble, and he was talking about food here, that he was mindful of that. He was going to be careful about that. Today's short Bible lesson, and this is a good one, and you should go and read this. This is by Wes McAdams over at radicallychristian.com. Now, he posted this back on April 25th, 2015, but it still rings true today, and this is a really good one. 3 reasons Christians need to be fasting. I think this is one of the areas in our Christian walk with God, and especially with me, that I don't do enough of. Is fasting. I'm not saying we need to be fasting every day, but we need to get this idea of fasting and what it really means to be fasting. And 3 reasons Christians need to be fasting today. I'm positive that if we started biblically fasting in our lives, that it would improve our relationship with God and improve our relationship with one another. Chuck Higgins. I'd have to rack my brain, Dave. It sounds familiar. Dave asked me a question about an old shipmate from the subs over in Scotland, and that I vaguely the name strikes a small chord in my gray matter. And just real quick here, I'm going to say this to Dave. Someone shared on Facebook, on the Hundley page on Facebook. It saddens me. I mean, it really saddened me this morning. Pictures of the USS Hundley in a Louisiana scrapyard being cut to pieces. I was always kind of hoping after I got out of the Navy that they would, when they decommissioned the Hundley, that like the submarine, they would find a place for that and turn it into a museum. Because it was, nuclear sub. Now, it wasn't a nuclear subtender, but we supported the Polaris nuclear submarines, and it was a missile subtender. It was a pretty big part of our military history. So, but anyway, I don't want to digress too much there. But it did sadden me. Now, we just came through the Alabama special election, and I was looking at the news this morning. I don't know if Roy Moore is calling for a recount because he has to pay for that. I don't know if he's going to do that or not. And Long is, he's reported to be the winner, and he did win by a little bit, but he won. In my opinion, especially with all the shenanigans that were going on by groups like Indivisible and Let America Vote and Common Cause, these George Soros-supported groups, and some of these robocalls that were going on, telling people if they voted for Judge Roy Moore that their votes are public and people will find out about it, and you don't want to be in that position, which that's a lie. Your votes are not public that way. I can't just walk into the clerk of courts or the county clerk and ask to find out who voted for who. It doesn't work that way. So, but they were scaring people down there, and yet on the other hand, they turn around and they're really against, especially Let America Vote and Common Cause, they're really against voter ID laws. And they lie every time they talk about a state that has voter ID laws. All it suppresses the poorest and the minorities in the states, right? And Indiana is one of these examples to where the opposite was actually true. Once they passed their voter ID laws, minority voting went up. And some of the reasons, not all of them, but some of the reasons that were given that I had read about were some of these folks didn't vote because they didn't think their vote counted, because they weren't sure if people were voting that shouldn't have been voting. And so, and this is documented, verifiable. You can go use, if you use Google, fine. I use DuckDuckGo, but you can go research it on the internet and find it out. But that's, I read this years ago about that. But that in Alabama and these other states, Let America Vote has been putting out how bad voter ID is and how it disenfranchises people, right? And in Alabama, what the thing was going around with Let America Vote on Facebook and Twitter that I've been trying to counteract was that Alabama had shut down, the state of Alabama had shut down about 10 DMV offices, okay? And there's a lot of states that are doing that. A lot of states are getting rid of the DMV offices. Matter of fact, Pennsylvania has gotten rid of a lot of those. And it used to be you had to go to the state capitol to get your anything to do with your cars, or mail it or physically go to the state capitol. And what they did was they quit that and actually hired subcontractors to do it, which the subcontractors are doing it very cheaply, and they're able to be in the communities where people want to be at. So what Let America Vote has done, and I haven't gone back and checked to see where they've shut down the DMVs in Alabama. They keep saying it's in 10 of the poorest, blackest sections of Alabama, of the state, you know, and communities and stuff. And I haven't really checked that out because when I was checking, and every time I get a complaint about voter ID, I go in and check that state they're complaining about, and I haven't found a state yet that has passed a voter ID law that didn't bend over backwards in that law to make sure everybody who wanted a voter ID got one. And so guess what? Guess what Alabama did? And I've been laughing my backside off this ever since I found this, right? And I was looking for this yesterday, and I found it this morning. Let me get over here real quick. This is the Secretary of State of Alabama's site, right, for the government. Now, I'm not disputing that Alabama didn't shut down some DMV offices. I'm really not disputing that at all. However, if you go and just research, you do browser research on how to get a voter ID in Alabama, it says how to get a free photo voter ID card in Alabama, a free one, okay? And right underneath the title, if you look, if you're, this is the funny part, folks. This is really the funny part of this whole thing, was right here. I'm going to highlight it right here. Request mobile ID unit. And I'm like, wow, there's a concept. There is a concept. And guess what? You go over here. Instructions. Request photo voter ID mobile unit. They got ID response units out there, so if you really need an ID to vote, you can get it. They come to your house. To submit instructions, to submit your request for a home visit or group event by our photo ID mobile unit, please fill out this form. Please note that all fields below are required. A mobile ID event must be requested a minimum of 2 weeks in advance. Privacy notice: information submitted to the office on this page will be used for official purposes only. And you go on there and you say group event, individual event. If you go an organization, if it's a group, event details if it is, and then they have your date for the visit or the event, and then they have contact information, and you can submit it. Okay? Now, I know what they're going to say. Well, what about folks that don't have internet access? Can they do this? Folks, especially the group event. A lot of folks, not every one of them, but a lot of folks go to church. And there's very few churches I know of today that do not have an internet presence. Okay? And so if you don't have a voter ID and you want to vote, and you cry because you can't get it, especially in Alabama, well, I'm poor and I can't get it. Look, it's a free ID. They'll come to your individual house, or let's say your church or civic group, does a photo ID drive, and says, look, if you don't have a photo ID drive, you can get a free one, and they canvass the areas and stuff like that. And this is one thing, real quick, I'm going to back up here a second. This is one thing I have against Let America Vote, because they don't talk about this. They talk about getting out the vote, and in states like Alabama, yeah, you can get out the vote, but you got to make sure they have a photo ID card in order to vote. And all I ever see on Let America Vote, especially, is they're complaining about how voter ID laws actually disenfranchise the poor. Well, that's not lie. That's not even a lie of omission. That's just not lie. Because if they just take 2 seconds, I'm serious. When I started this search, I timed myself. Less than a minute, I found this site about requesting a photo ID, and it talks about a free photo ID over on this page. How to get a free photo ID card. And the requirements for what you have to show aren't that much. Okay, birth certificate, hospital nursing home record, marriage record, state of federal census record, military record, Medicare or Medicaid document, Social Security Administration document, certification or certificate of citizenship, and official school record transcript. Okay, and And they even have a section down there that says who is not required for photo ID prior to voting. They have a voting accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, and also if you do a absentee ballot, you have to put your information down, and then they can research that information. So again, folks, I have to laugh about this, and I just wanted to bring that up to you because this is what we're up against. This is what conservatives, especially a constitutional conservative like myself, who happens to be a Christian, this is what we're up against. And I put this out before. Matter of fact, if I was living in Alabama, I would try to be organizing some of these events. You can have a good old time at a mobile photo ID event. Make it up like a potluck or something like that, or have a few festivities around it. Make it fun and enjoyable for the kids, so they don't have to worry about getting a babysitter to go out to it. There's all sorts of ideas that you could do. But I have yet to see anything from Let America Vote that they would help folks get photo ID, especially free ones. And again, every state I've researched, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Iowa, now Alabama, and some other ones like if I speak, which I don't want to, there's other ones I've checked. Every time I went and read the law, they make provisions in there. They bend over backwards. If you can't afford one will be given to you. Okay, and like I said, the biggest complaint in Alabama is they shut down 10 DMVs down in Alabama. But yet they never said anything about, well, they may have shut down the DMVs, but now they have mobile ID units. Wow. That's a pretty big omission. Let me see. Dave's got a couple comments up here from Fox News. Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel has caused a backlash in the region, particularly among Muslims, and the reactions reverberated to Nazareth, where the town's mayor, Ali Salam, announced Thursday that all planned Christmas events would be canceled. Real quick here, since Dave brought this up, I was going to start getting into this more next week and stuff. The United States, I think wrongly, has been, and don't take me the wrong way when I say this, I think they have been supporting Israel for the wrong reasons. I've heard over the years, I've heard way too many people out there talk about how, the Jewish people in Israel, they're God's chosen people. Big time Jews like Ben Shapiro and other ones they talk about Jesus Christ wasn't the Messiah. They were looking for physical deliverance. A lot of Jews feel that the new state of Israel that was established in 1949 by the UN to give Israel back to the Jews, they feel that this is part of that physical deliverance that they were looking for. And so the United States, I think, wrongly has been supporting Israel for the wrong reasons. Now, I'm not against supporting Israel as a nation, and I'm not against supporting them because they're a good ally in the area. But I think making erroneous decisions based on a false biblical premise, is very dangerous for the country. And I know I've been kicked off chat rooms for saying stuff like this. Dan, you're an anti-Semite. How dare you? I said, I'm not saying that Israel should not exist. I'm just saying you need to really be looking at the scriptures. And nowhere, I've asked some Jewish folks, nowhere, I've asked them to look for it. And they cannot give it to me. Where does it say in the Old Testament that Jesus Christ was to come, the Messiah was to come and physically deliver the Jews, Israel, Jerusalem, out of Roman captivity? It doesn't. It doesn't. So we need to be real careful. And I always try to be real careful in my support for Israel to make sure it's not based on a biblical thing. I've had people actually say, well, if Jerusalem becomes the capital, then they're going to be able to build the third temple and set in motion prophecy. And again, it's like, where do you get this? What scriptures do you point to that talks about the temple being built again? And even if it was,
real quick here, even if the temple was rebuilt again, you're never going to have actual biblical temple worship there, because can you prove the lineage of the Levites and the priesthood? You know, in order to have temple worship, you have to have priests. In order for the priest to be able to serve, they have to be able to prove their lineage from the tribe of Levi. Can you do that? Because the Rome, when they came through and destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't carry away all the parchments from the temple. They took away the gold and everything like that, but the parchments got burnt. You know, and it's just it's just that simple. They were destroyed, and a lot of those parchments were actually the lineage of the Jewish people, especially from the tribe of Levi. So you know that, you know, I didn't want to get into that, but you know that's where we're standing at today. Now, you know, like I said, I titled the show today, the compliance costs of net neutrality and freedom. You know, the cost to comply with net neutrality and what it's going to cost us in freedom if we don't get rid of net neutrality and the Title II utility on here. Let me get over here real quick. I still think that Alabama thing, I was laughing when I saw that. Oh, they got rid of all those DMVs, but they set up mobile ID unit. Okay, and I don't know if there's more than one it didn't say in there, but I'd be kind of neat to find out how many they actually got set up in the state that they can go out there. And I imagine they're probably cheaper to run than having an office with the utilities and the personnel and everything like that. Okay. All right, I want to get to this one here. This one is gigaom.com. Net neutrality's cost to consumers pegged at $17 billion or zero, and this is by Jeff Roberts. Okay. After a dramatic shift in the debate over net neutrality last month, many expect the FCC will reclassify internet providers so as to bar them from giving special treatment to some websites or others. The question now becomes how much, if at all, the agency's decision will turn on an arcane process called Title II will cost customers. Now, this was written back in just before, like a year before, not even a year. It was December of 2014 that this was written. And so this Jeff Roberts was actually looking ahead to find out and think about what is the Title II classification, what's it going to cause or cost consumers? There's got to be a compliance cost there, right? Depending on who you ask, the answer is that Title II, which would treat internet providers akin to public utilities, will be ruinously expensive or will have little financial impact at all. Among the Cassandras, you can count Republican FCC Chairman or FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai. It will cost $17 billion in new fees, Pai told an audience of telecom lawyers in Washington on Friday, warning that consumers' monthly internet bills are set to soar. Pai's number, which has also popped up on the Wall Street Journal editorial page and other right-leaning outlets, is lifted from the purported study by the Progressive Policy Institute, a think tank that has reportedly taken funding from company AT&T. Okay, the crux of PPI study is that the state and local governments will seize on the Title II legal regime to impose a bevy of new internet taxes, and that the FCC will soon apply a levy known as the Universal Service Fund levy to internet users. The $17 billion figure, if accurate, provides additional ammunition for companies like Comcast and AT&T, which are lobbying fiercely to stop net neutrality. The companies have already claimed that the new legal classification will dissuade them from investing in new internet infrastructure, though the $41 billion industry just spent on spectrum cast doubt on that claim. And this, like I said, folks, this is before it actually was quantified in law, or as regulatory law anyway, on May of 2015, the open internet regulations. Like so much else in the pitch debate over net neutrality, however, the $17 billion number may have been ginned up for political purposes. According to Free Press, a nonpartisan advocacy group for open internet, the figure represents a misleading worst-case scenario that will never come to pass. As the group points out, reclassification does not appear to require any new customer fees. Such fees, if they do appear, will instead be the result of a separate set of decisions by the FCC and various governments. Now let me stop the reading here, folks. When they reclassified the internet as Title II, and they passed these regulations that went along with this, how does the FCC find out if companies are in compliance, if internet providers are in compliance? They got reporting requirements, folks. They have reporting requirements. And so that means the ISPs and companies like that have to have people on hand that understand regulations. If they don't, then they hire a consulting firm that helps maybe their personnel that's gathering all this information and filing the reports, or actually hire a company to come in and do that for them, which isn't cheap. And one of the I don't think it's in this one, but one of the other articles, and I don't give you all the articles, I don't cover all the articles or read them that I give you. And I thought this was funny, one of the articles that was trying to figure it out, this group was basing, I got to laugh about this a little bit, folks. The group was basing the cost of personnel, their hourly cost, the man-hour cost, using minimum wage figures. I don't know about you or any company, and I don't know if Dave, if the company you have, if you have regulation compliance officers, whether it be the IRS or, that's the big one. I was talking in my description of the show, one of the most horrific ones of late came out of Obamacare, and that's the individual requirement to prove to the IRS that you have health insurance, or they're going to tax you $2,000 for that year. So not only do you have to take, and it doesn't take much time, but you have to take time to do that. Your employer has to mail you a certificate just like they would your tax forms, because we've gotten one ever since Obamacare has come into being from our employers stating that we had insurance that we have to put along and send on to the IRS. This is going to be no different. The FCC, the requirements of compliance and the compliance cost are what pro-net neutrality folks, they never bring up. They never bring up, and if they do, if they're on the progressive side of things, liberal side of things, they want to go the low end. And I remember at the door plant I worked at, we had an EPA compliance officer. It was a college person. They actually had college in environmental sciences and stuff, and they were the compliance officer, and they were on salary, and they got paid good money. And plus we had a consulting firm because they came in and helped us figure out a few things. And we were also like green certified, and that cost us money to get that type of certification, which went a long way towards the EPA requirements. And it just added more and more cost to the product that they passed on. This was a cost of production that they passed on to the consumers. And it's no different with the internet, whether it's zero money, which I know it isn't. I've read in other articles where some small ISPs out in California, they had a couple 100,000 customers. They estimated because they're Title II now, the compliance reporting cost went up to around $40,000 a year. Now that may not seem like a lot to you, but you continually have to pass that cost off onto your customers. And pretty soon, because of regulations, you're going to price yourself out of the market. He goes on in here, two different debates. To understand the fuss over the alleged $17 billion of new customer costs, it's helpful to recognize that the current debate over the internet is actually two debates. The first turns on net neutrality. The second turns on what sort of taxes and fees should apply to the internet. And one debate is not intrinsically tied to the other. And that's... Please. They both are. They're tied together. In the case of net neutrality, an FCC decision to reclassify internet providers as common carriers under Title II would trigger a new set of regulatory obligations, but the agency has the power to immediately excuse the companies from any of the obligations, a process called forbearance in telecom parlance. Well, I read this yesterday. It's like, if you're going to be able to excuse or pass out forbearances, well, why have the regulation to begin with? It's the government picking and choosing. And, I haven't heard anybody that's pro net neutrality say anything about this. Already the agency has signaled that that's exactly what it plans to do. If the plan goes ahead, broadband providers will be barred from providing fast lanes for selected websites, but will also get a pass from antiquated portions of the reclassification law. For consumers, no new broadband fees spring into place if the FCC waves its regulatory wand and turns internet providers into common carriers. But that doesn't end the larger concerns over fees and taxes or eliminates conservatives' fears that consumer internet bills will soon be filled with the same maddening series of charges that appear on their phone bills or on their electric bills. And I should have prepared. I didn't. I get my my bills for my internet over the. Let me see if I can find one real quick here. Service electric cable. I don't know if I can get on there to see my bill or anything like that, but anyway, there are fees that are on that, and there's a couple of them. And we've been paying, if you've had internet access for a while, broadband, you've been paying a tax on there. That goes to my $400 billion story about where'd that tax money go, because it wasn't spent. Where'd it go? Okay. The outcome of the debate will not turn to Title II, but on issues tied to the FCC's general powers over telecommunications, and to a large part on whether Congress decides to extend the Internet Tax Freedom Act, okay, a law that forbids states and local governments from taxing internet services. That law, known as ITFA, will expire on December 11th, and unless Congress renews it, consumers could get hit with all sorts of charges, no matter what the FCC does with the internet net neutrality. Why is the federal government taxing this? Why do they need this tax on the internet? Again, that act, that Internet Freedom Act, leaves the government the only agency or entity that can actually tax the internet. I've often wondered this. And again, if the state and local municipalities add a tax onto the internet, then it's up to us, the residents of that state, to get a hold of our representatives, if we don't like it, to complain about it. And we have a better chance of getting it stopped at the local, especially local level, and the state level than we do the federal level. Again, going back to the Constitution, someone please tell me in the Constitution where the FCC should ever exist. I'm begging you. I'm begging you to show me that. As for FCC adding charges to broadband bills, the agency already has the power to do so under the Universal Service Fund. This is a levy that has appeared on consumers' phone bills for decades and is spent on things like subsidizing phone for low-income Americans, school broadband, or building telecommunication infrastructure in rural areas. Again, go back to my article last week about, and I have the link in the show notes page on episode 937 today, and I've had it the past couple days on there about broadband hang on a second, that's just broadband investment. I will put that up there. I will look that up there for the $400 billion spent, and I'll get that on the show notes page today also. I just got to dig back a couple days. Collecting and spending the funds is a policy decision for the agency that is unrelated, however, to net neutrality. The problem is, it all goes together. The open internet, the Title II classification, The whole thing goes together in the open internet. You can't split the two out. And if you do, you're being disingenuous in the extreme. So that's the one. And this is the other one from Newsonomics, estimating the true cost of FCC regulation. Ever since the FCC began kicking around the idea of new internet regulations, aka net neutrality regulations, and this was actually, there was no date on this, and I'm frustrated when they put these articles up and they never date them. The Progressive Policy Institute recently circulated its study, for example, attempting to estimate the additional taxes and fees from the FCC's net internet order. After originally deciding upon a figure of $15 billion in new cost, it revised its number down to $11 billion after Congress subsequently renewed the Internet Tax Freedom Act prohibiting taxes on internet services. The $11 billion figure is still disputed by some, but regardless of what these particular costs will be, estimates still fail to capture compliance costs, as well as what the economists call opportunity costs and the additional burden these shifts will have on consumers. Again, anytime you have a regulation on an industry and there's reporting requirements in there, i.e. compliance costs, those are always passed on to the consumer. The consumer's the one that takes it into teeth. And it usually hits the middle class and the lower income families the hardest, because they're the ones that least have the flexibility in their budgets to add more to, especially those that are on fixed income. You know, and it's just, again, this is another article I encourage you to go read, and this is the one I was talking about. If you go down here a little ways here, one way to estimate regulatory costs is to use the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs good faith estimate of the number of hours of paperwork that a new regulation will require. A recent figure by OIRA suggested that the federal government regulations resulted in more than 10 billion hours of time spent on paperwork each year. Now I'm talking about all government regulations, okay? However, it created using an hourly wage of $7.45 an hour, below the minimum wage rate, at least in 27 states. No one working on compliance in this country will earn so little. No, they won't. Usually they're in management, and usually they're salaried, and usually they make a pretty good buck, because it's to be in compliance with regulations is a pretty serious thing. They want to make sure they have competent people that are working on that, and a lot of times it's not just one person. Sometimes they have a small department, you know, of a department head and you know, 3, 4, 5, however many they need, depending on the regulations that they have to comply with. And some, like, I'm just going back to Mohawk Flush Doors. We had a safety director, and they were in charge of making sure we were in compliance with OSHA safety regulations. We had an EPA, environmental compliance officer, as it were, to make sure we were in compliance with the DEP and environmental EPA regulations, and both of them had small staffs that they had. Plus, our mother company, Masonite, had a whole department that a lot of these things went up through too, because Masonite owned them, that they rechecked everything up there to make sure everything was okay. So there's layers of compliance in these, in all these regulations. And to sit there and say that if net neutrality is allowed to stand, that these requirements, these compliance requirements, aren't going to cost the ISPs and the consumers money is just sheer fallacy. You're living over in a dreamland that doesn't exist. You know, it just, again, you never hear them thinking about this or even talking about this. You know, it's going to cost more money to keep these in there. Another couple things before we end the show here today. Net neutrality violations, a brief history. I've been saying about, I wanted to get to this past couple days. I was going to get to this yesterday. And this is by the Free Press. Let me get up here. This is by Timothy Carr over to freepress.net. Note, this is an updated version of an older post due to the Trump administration's recent attacks on net neutrality. We felt it was important to resurface these important examples of what happens when cable and phone companies are left to their own devices. Now, before I continue my reading here, every one of these cases before net neutrality were settled. Every one of them were adjudicated in some way, fashion, or form. Okay? The principle that protects free speech and innovation online is irrelevant, they claim, as blocking has never, ever happened. And if it did, they add, market forces would compel internet service providers to correct course and reopen their networks. Now, let me stop the thing here. That we go clear back on this to 2005. Almost all, not all of them, but a vast majority of these complaints, and I'm not going to go down and read them all. Go to the DanClementShow.com and click on that article there about the net neutrality violations of brief history. The vast majority, not all of them, a vast majority of them had to do with cell phone internet access. And a lot of the ones that they complain about are the big cell phone companies. But since 2005, and I'll just peg it back to there because this is where the article goes, we only had a handful of cell phone companies back then. Used to be, I remember Cellular One was around, AT&T, Verizon. I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't remember Sprint being around. And I don't remember a lot of small carriers, quite honestly. It was just those Cellular One, Verizon, and AT&T, because I remember driving truck, and those are the ones, especially Verizon and AT&T, were the two big ones that I used. I used both of them when I was driving truck. I ended up, the last major one I was on was Verizon until I found Boost Mobile, and I've been on Boost Mobile for years now. But they were still, the technology, the smartphone technology was outstripping their ability to provide internet access, or at least unlimited or broadband internet access to as many customers who wanted it. So they, in order to be fair to everybody, they had to start throttling things. They had to start putting caps on, and people were going nuts. They were going ballistic about this. And this actually, I believe, caused some of these smaller companies, Metro PC, Cricket, Boost Mobile, Sprint came on the scene. Like I said, Sprint may have been back then. I think they might have been one of the carriers back then, but they weren't as big as AT&T or Verizon at the time. I think, matter of fact, I think they were, because they had that. It's almost like the walkie-talkie ability. I can't even remember what to call it now, but it was like instead of clicking on a cell phone, it was like acting like a walkie-talkie. And if you had other people that were hooked up to you, like almost like a contact for your text messages, you could call them. But that was an extra cost on the service, above and beyond your cell phone. So again, smartphone technology was outstripping the cell phone carriers' ability to give everybody broadband. And it took them a few years to get caught up. And it took them some competition from these smaller companies who actually grew through that time. That competition actually made things better. So they list these, this like Madison River, North Carolina ISP. But the FCC took care of that. Comcast in 2005, the nation's largest ISP, began secretly blocking peer-to-peer technologies. Okay? For whatever reason they were doing that. And they got caught, and, they got their wrist slapped, or their back of their hand slapped, okay? TELUS, Canada's, and I'm even going to include that as a Canadian one. AT&T in 2007 to 2009 forced Apple to block Skype and other competing VoIP phone services on the iPhone. The wireless provider wanted to prevent iPhone users from using the application that would allow them to make calls on such over-the-top voice services, or VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol. The Google Voice app received similar treatment from carriers like AT&T when it came on the scene in 2009. Again,
we're still talking about the early, even back in the late 2000s, we're talking about the early days of smartphone internet use. And I had issues, not that my cable, Service Electric cable television, my internet provider, when I started using VoIP, even back before 2009, we've been using VoIP ever since we had cable internet here. And that was back in the mid 2000s. And so we were using VoIP because it was cheaper. And at first it wasn't good because of the bandwidth usage and stuff. It just wasn't that good. But now you can't tell when I'm on my telephone over a landline. You just can't tell. And we've had VoIP for years now. Metro PC in 2011 at the time was one of the top 5 U.S. wireless carriers, announced plans to block streaming video over its 4G network from all sources except YouTube. Metro PCS then threw its weight behind Verizon's court challenge against the FCC's 2010 Open Internet ruling, hoping that rejection of the agency's authority would allow the company to continue its anti-consumer practices. And again, you're talking about cell phones, and you're talking about these companies were scrambling at this time. If you go back and do some research on this, to put in place enough bandwidth to handle the requests that these, like I said, sometimes technology outstrips other technology. It definitely outstrips regulations and government control. And back then, like I said, not everybody was using cell phones as their end all to be all to everything. I know people that do not have home computers. They have smartphones and they watch everything on that, or they have, cable TV, or they have smart TVs hooked up to the internet like I do. I don't have a smart TV hooked up to the internet, but I use a Roku box to watch things and access the internet on my big screen TV. And even that in the early days wasn't the best because of bandwidth restrictions. The companies just did not have the bandwidth in place to handle all this. I'm sorry, that's the way it was. Now everybody's catching up to it, and I don't want to belabor this. I don't want to get laborious on this and really string this out. But again, all these violations were handled back then before net neutrality, before the open internet orders of May 2015. And again, competition took care of a lot of these, as it normally does. Dave is saying we are charged a universal service fund for every customer we provide service for. It comes about 2.8% of our bill. So it's a percentage of your bill. Okay, and again, I'll put that story up on the show notes page today that I shared last week about the $400 billion collected in taxes to give broadband to schools, rural areas, and all that kind of stuff. And people were trying to trace this money where to go. Where are the proof of the investments? And I came across an article. I think there's a group out there that's trying to get a Freedom of Information Act, or at least they have one started to get that information from the FCC to find out if this money was spent or not, because they can't find the evidence that it was spent. And so again, the whole thing, and I'm going to end the show here on this. It's a mixed bag of things. I've said on comments on videos that are pro net neutrality, I just have this feeling, I can't put my finger on it, but companies like Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, one of the biggest ISPs in the country that are battling against net neutrality, I think they're scamming people. I really do. I think in all honesty, they want government regulations because it'll help them stifle any competition that comes into their area. And net neutrality does not take care of, if the regulation stays in place or goes, it does not address the biggest problem with internet access, and that is of local monopolies. In no way, shape, or form does it address the local monopolies. And Dave, how many different broadband internet providers do you have to your house? For like your cable internet, How many? Most people will tell you they only have one. And so these big companies, like I said, I have this gut feeling about this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just having a little bit of indigestion. But I have this gut feeling that they're against net neutrality to gin up the pro-net neutrality folks, because in actuality they want net neutrality. They want that government regulation in place, so they only have one source to go and corrupt. And folks, when the government puts regulations on any industry, it opens the door for corruption. It always has, always will. That's why I think we need less regulations than we do need more. I think, and I believe I'm right in this, and I think it's rightly so, that the free market will take care of a lot of this stuff. I think the free market is better equipped to take care of bad actors. And no, it doesn't take care of them right away, but it eventually does. And tell me, and I've asked people this too, please show me an example where the government was able to swoop in and quickly take care of a bad actor. And I keep going back to this example of this egg producer out in Western Ohio that sold a lot of eggs that were contaminated with salmonella, and some people got sick on it. And it wasn't within 2 weeks that they were not producing anymore. And the reason why they weren't producing anymore, because these stores quit buying off them. They had other places they could go get their eggs from. They quit buying off them. And by the time the government came in there and really started doing this investigation and stuff like that, they were pretty much out of business. I talked to a couple different brokers that had accounts that were, trying to find companies for them, and they said they just went out of business. They just could not handle the public backlash, and just having to buy back all the eggs and nobody wanting to buy their stuff, and just those the public backlash for that. So don't tell me that the free market doesn't take care of bad actors, and don't tell me that the free market. That there isn't a free market here in America, because you don't know what you're talking about. Every day that you go out and shop for something, you have multiple choices in whatever that item is that you're shopping for. That's free market. That's the free market. If we didn't have a free market, you'd only have one choice. You'd be like old Soviet Russia, where you had one car you could buy, you had one tractor you could buy to plow your fields, and that's it. You didn't have a choice. There was no competition. This is what the state said that you needed to do the job, and that was it. And that's exactly what regulations does. Regulations harm more than they help. They really, really do. And it just amazes me how many people don't get that. How many people really just, they for whatever reason, they like government regulations more than they like people being free. And just one last thing, and I wore this T-shirt today for my buddy Dave, and basically it says, England forever, and Scotland for a wee bit longer. And I love this. I wear this every now and then, and I remind Dave of it every time I do wear it, because we were both stationed in Scotland. As far as I know, we both still really like Scotland. Well, that's the music. That's the end of the show. I'm Dan Clements, your host of the Dan Clements Show. Remember, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. If you like the show, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. If you're not subscribed to the show, if you just caught this in passing, please subscribe to the show and hit the notification button, so when I have new videos coming out, you'll know when they come out and they're posted. And also, I'm looking for patrons. I'm looking for folks to support the show on a monthly basis. So I have a Patreon account set up, and I also have a pay account set up. That's it for the show today. We'll see you tomorrow for Free For All Friday. I can't believe it's Friday already, folks. I really can't believe it's Friday. And we're going to talk about, a little bit tomorrow, we're going to talk about, is internet access a human right? Because they're making this argument now about that. We'll see you tomorrow at noon. God bless, and have a wonderful rest of the day, folks.